The horrifying murder of John Lennon. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon had a pretty normal start to the day. For a rock star, that is. After taking a break from music, Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, had just released a new album called Double Fantasy. Lennon spent that morning promoting the album. First, he and Uno had an appointment with Annie Leibovitz. The famous photographer had come to get a picture for Rolling Stone. After some debate, Lennon decided he would pose nude, and his wife would remain clothed. Leibovitz snapped what would become one of the famous images of the couple. Both Uno and Lennon were thrilled with the photo. "This is it," Lennon said to Leibovitz when she showed him the Polaroid. "This is our relationship." At one point during the conversation, Lennon mused about getting older. "When we were kids, 30 was death, right?" he said. "I'm 40 now and I feel better than before." During the interview, Lennon also reflected upon his extensive body of work. "I consider that my work won't be finished until I'm dead and buried, and I hope that's a long, long time." Sadly, Lennon would die later that very same day. When Lennon and Uno left the Dakota a few hours later, they briefly met the man who would kill Lennon later that day. Waiting outside the apartment building, Mark David Chapman held a copy of Double Fantasy in his hands. Ron Hummel, a producer who was with Lennon and Uno, remembers the moment well. He recalls that Chapman silently held out his copy of Double Fantasy, which Lennon signed. Chapman was silent, Hummel said. John asked, "Is this all you want?" And again, Chapman said nothing. Unsurprisingly, Chapman also remembers this moment. "He was very kind to me," Chapman said of Lennon. "Ironically, very kind, and was very patient with me. The limousine was waiting, and he took his time with me, and he got the pen going and he signed my album. He asked me if I needed anything else. I said, no, sir. And he walked away. A very cordial and decent man." But Lennon's kindness to Chapman didn't change anything. The 25-year-old who was living in Hawaii at the time had specifically flown to New York to murder John Lennon. Although he had considered other celebrity murders, including John Lennon's former bandmate, Paul McCartney, Chapman had developed a specific hatred toward Lennon. Chapman's animosity toward the former Beatles started when Lennon infamously declared that his group was more popular than Jesus. As this time went on, Chapman began to see Lennon as a poser. On his last day of work as a security guard in Hawaii, Chapman signed out of his shift as usual, but he wrote John Lennon instead of his real name. He then prepared to fly to New York City. But before killing John Lennon, Chapman apparently wanted an autograph first. After Lennon obliged, Chapman slunk back into the shadows near the apartment. He watched as Lennon and Uno got into their limousine. And drove away. Then he waited at 10:50 p.m. on December 8, 1980. John Lennon and Yoko Ono returned home to the Dakota. Chapman later said, "John came out and he looked at me, and I think he recognized, here's the fellow that I signed the album earlier," and he walked past me. As Lennon walked toward his home, Chapman raised his weapon. He fired his gun 5 times, and 4 of the bullets hit Lennon in the back. Lennon staggered into the building, crying, "I'm shot." Uno, who according to Chapman, ducked for cover when she heard the shots, rushed to hold her husband after she realized she had been attacked. "I stood there with the gun hanging limply down at my right side," Chapman recounted in a later interview. "Jose, the doorman, came over and he's crying and is grabbing and he's shaking my arm and he shook the gun right out of my hand, which was a very brave thing to do to an armed person, and he kicked the gun across the pavement." Chapman stood patiently and waited to be arrested, reading The Catcher in the Rye, a novel he was obsessed with. He would later be sentenced to 20 years to life for the murder of John Lennon. According to reports, John Lennon died almost instantly after being shot, bleeding profusely and too injured to wait for an ambulance. Lennon was placed in a police car and sped to Roosevelt Hospital, but it was too late. Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival, and news of the shooting had already spread like wildfire. Stephen Lynn, the doctor who emerged to speak to the press, made the official declaration that Lennon was gone. Doctors officially pronounced Lennon dead at 11:07 p.m. on December 8, 1980. And as Lynn told the crowd, John Lennon's cause of death was likely a severe wound from the gunshots. Like and follow for more wild stories in rock music.